The air in the classroom was heavy with restless noise. Pens clicked, sneakers squeaked against the linoleum floor, and chatter rose and fell in waves as if no one cared about the lesson. It was the last period of the day, and attention was already thin, but today the atmosphere felt different. A new teacher stood at the front, her first day substituting for the regular instructor. She was young, composed, and neatly dressed in a light blouse and slacks, her hair tied back in a way that suggested both practicality and professionalism. She carried herself with calm authority, though her soft voice and fresh face made some students exchange knowing smirks. For the first 15 minutes, she tried her best to engage the class. Her tone was patient, her explanations clear. A few students listened, taking notes, though most leaned back in their chairs, whispering, texting under the desk, or doodling. In the back row sat a small group of notorious troublemakers, the kind who lived for chaos. They had already sized her up from the moment she walked in, their eyes glittering with mischief. To them, she was just another young substitute to push around, a target to test their boundaries on. The leader of the group, a boy with an oversized hoodie and a cocky smirk, leaned over to his friends. "She looks like she's never even yelled at anyone," he whispered, his voice carrying just enough for nearby classmates to hear. Laughter bubbled in response. The teacher glanced up at the sound, her eyes briefly resting on him, but she didn't scold, she simply continued writing on the board, her chalk strokes steady. That small act of composure only encouraged them. They wanted a reaction. As she turned back to face the class, one of the bullies muttered something crude about her, loud enough for his friends but quiet enough to pretend it wasn't directed. The group chuckled, glancing at her as though waiting for her to blush or stumble. But she didn't falter. Her calm presence, her steady gaze as she resumed the lesson, unsettled them in a way they couldn't articulate. So they decided to escalate. The ringleader slouched further into his chair, then abruptly stood, stretching as though bored. His sneakers squealed across the floor as he strolled casually toward the front, his friends egging him on with nudges and laughter. The teacher stiffened slightly but kept her face neutral, continuing to explain the problem on the board. Students' eyes darted between the two of them, sensing something brewing. The boy came close, invading her personal space in a way meant to intimidate. He smirked, pretending to brush dust off her sleeve. "You're too serious, miss," he said mockingly. Then, in one sudden, deliberate tug, he yanked at the fabric of her blouse. The sharp sound of tearing fabric sliced through the air. Gasps filled the classroom. The rip wasn't large, but it was enough to leave her shoulder exposed, the delicate fabric hanging unevenly. Laughter erupted from the bullies, loud and cruel, bouncing off the walls. Some students covered their mouths, horrified, others stared wide-eyed, unable to believe what had just happened. Phones were lifted discreetly, screens glowing as some tried to record. The young teacher stood frozen for a heartbeat, her breath caught in her chest. The sting of humiliation pricked at her skin, and heat spread across her face. For a lesser person, that moment could have broken them, tears, panic, or flight. That was what the bullies expected. They were ready to bask in her embarrassment, to replay this moment in whispers and jokes for weeks. But she did not crumble. Her eyes narrowed ever so slightly, her expression calm but transformed. Her breathing slowed, steadying itself. Beneath the professional blouse and quiet demeanor, there was something else, something disciplined, something trained. She shifted her stance just a fraction, squaring her shoulders, grounding her feet in a way only those who had practiced self-defense would notice. The bullies didn't recognize it, but a few students closest to her felt the change in the air. The mocking laughter grew quieter, thinning as unease crept into the room. Her gaze moved from the ringleader's smug face to the rest of the class, scanning the room with quiet intensity. The confidence in her eyes was different now, harder, sharper, like steel concealed beneath silk. The boy who had ripped her shirt grinned wider, mistaking her silence for weakness. "What's the matter, miss?" he sneered, his friends chuckling again. Too scared to say something. But what no one in that room realized yet was that this teacher wasn't scared at all. She wasn't broken. She was waiting. And when she moved, the entire class would see exactly why she wasn't someone to laugh at. The classroom had fallen into a strange, charged silence after the sound of tearing fabric. For a moment, The only noise came from the soft buzz of fluorescent lights overhead and the faint squeak of a chair as someone shifted uncomfortably. The ringleader stood there with his smug grin, enjoying the attention, convinced he had humiliated the new teacher beyond repair. His friends chuckled behind him, some slapping their desks, but the laughter lacked the same confidence it had a moment ago. Something about the way the teacher stood, perfectly still, her eyes locked onto him, unsettled them even if they didn't want to admit it. The teacher didn't speak immediately. She let the weight of her silence fill the air. Some students began to realize this wasn't embarrassment, it was calculation. She inhaled deeply, centering herself in a way that betrayed years of discipline. Her hands, though clenched for a brief moment, relaxed as if she were preparing for a task she had done many times before. The boy stepped closer, emboldened. He raised his hand as if to shove her lightly in the shoulder, trying to draw more laughter out of his friends. "Come on, don't look so serious," he taunted, the grin widening on his face. He never saw it coming. In one sharp, fluid motion, the teacher's hand shot up and caught his wrist before it could touch her. The smirk slid off his face, replaced with confusion that quickly melted into pain as her grip tightened with surprising strength. Gasps exploded from the students. The ringleader tried to pull back, but she twisted his arm with practiced precision, pivoted her body, and dropped her weight low. In an instant, he was no longer in control. His body flipped over her shoulder in a flawless judo throw. The classroom filled with the sharp thud of his back hitting the linoleum floor. The sound silenced the room completely. Laughter died mid-breath, replaced by stunned silence and wide eyes. The boy groaned, clutching his side, as the teacher released his arm and straightened smoothly, her breathing calm, her expression unchanged. She didn't gloat, didn't raise her voice. She simply stood, composed, as though tossing an arrogant teenager onto the floor was as natural as setting down a piece of chalk. One of the bully's friends pushed back his chair and stood, his face red with both anger and disbelief. "You can't do that," he shouted, though his voice cracked with nerves. Driven more by pride than sense, he lunged forward, aiming to grab her arm. The teacher sidestepped easily, letting his momentum carry him past her, then hooked his arm with her own and pivoted. With one swift move, she redirected his energy, sending him sprawling beside his friend with another echoing slam against the floor. Now the room erupted, not with laughter, but with gasps, whispers, and even cheers. Half the students couldn't believe what they had just seen. A teacher, someone they thought was meek, someone they thought was a pushover, had just dismantled the toughest bullies in the school without breaking a sweat. A few students clapped instinctively, the sound hesitant at first, then louder as others joined in. Phones that had been raised to record her humiliation were now catching something completely different, a display of discipline, power, and precision. The bullies were groaning on the floor, humiliated and stunned, their arrogance shattered. The teacher adjusted her torn blouse calmly, her posture straight and commanding. She didn't need to say much, her actions had already spoken volumes. But her eyes moved slowly across the classroom, scanning the students with quiet authority. No one dared to giggle or whisper now. When she finally spoke, her voice was low, steady, and razor-sharp. "Respect is not optional in this classroom," she said, her gaze flicking to the two boys on the ground. "And no one, puts their hands on me again. Do I make myself clear?" The silence was so absolute that the sound of a pencil rolling off a desk could be heard. Every student nodded, some quickly, some more hesitantly. Even those who had never respected authority found themselves straightening in their chairs, their eyes fixed on her as though she were something more than just a teacher. She wasn't just another adult trying to control them, she was someone who commanded respect in a way they couldn't ignore. The two bullies scrambled awkwardly to their knees, rubbing their backs and avoiding her eyes. Their bravado had evaporated. They had walked into this moment thinking they could mock her, humiliate her, and leave her powerless. Instead, they had been laid flat on the ground in front of everyone they had tried to impress. Their reputations were broken, their power stripped away in seconds. The teacher stepped back toward the board, picking up the chalk again as though nothing had happened. Her calmness was unnerving. She had demonstrated devastating skill without raising her voice or losing her composure. And that was what made it all the more terrifying for the bullies. By the time she turned back to continue the lesson, the classroom was utterly transformed. Students sat straighter, their attention locked on her every word. Phones were lowered, whispers died, and even the class clowns remained quiet. Everyone knew they had just witnessed something unforgettable. And for the first time, the new teacher didn't just have control of the classroom, she had their absolute respect. The classroom felt like a battlefield after a clash. The two boys who had dared to challenge the new teacher still lay groaning on the linoleum floor, stunned not only by the throws but by the realization that they had been outmatched in front of everyone. Their friends, who had been laughing moments earlier, sat frozen in their seats, their wide eyes darting between the teacher and the fallen bullies as if they couldn't believe what had just happened. Even the students who usually stayed neutral, heads down, focused on avoiding trouble, were staring openly now, a mixture of awe and fear flickering in their expressions. The teacher stood at the front of the room, adjusting the torn edge of her blouse with deliberate calm. Her movements were precise, composed, as though she had rehearsed this discipline countless times before. She didn't rush, didn't fidget, and most importantly, didn't look the slightest bit rattled. Her silence filled the room with more authority than yelling ever could. Everyone could feel it. The balance of power in the classroom had shifted completely. She stepped forward, slowly, her shoes clicking softly against the floor, each sound magnified in the otherwise hushed space. Her gaze swept across the class, not hurriedly, not nervously, but with the kind of confidence that made every student feel as though her eyes might linger on them at any moment. Even those who had done nothing wrong sat straighter in their chairs, their spines stiff, their hands folded on their desks. The bully's humiliation had become a lesson for everyone. Finally, she spoke, her voice low but sharp, carrying across the room with clarity that demanded attention. "Respect is not optional in this classroom," she said, pausing to let the words hang in the air. Her eyes cut toward the two boys on the floor, then flicked back to the rest of the students. "And anyone who thinks they can disrupt that respect," she tilted her head slightly, "will find out exactly what happens when they try." A ripple of whispers started to stir, but she silenced it instantly with nothing more than a raised brow. The authority in her posture, the memory of what they had just seen, kept everyone pinned to their seats. One brave student near the back, usually the loudest joker in the room, muttered under his breath, "Yes, ma'am," and though it was soft, it carried. A few others followed suit, nodding quickly, their faces flushed. The two bullies finally scrambled to their feet, their cheeks burning with shame. They avoided eye contact with everyone, especially the teacher. Their earlier bravado had crumbled into dust, and the snickers they had expected from classmates were replaced with stares of disbelief and smirks of satisfaction. Some students, usually their victims, were smiling for the first time, thrilled to see justice delivered so cleanly. The teacher didn't berate them further. She didn't need to. Instead, she gestured toward their desks with a small flick of her chin, an unspoken command that made them shuffle back to their seats with their heads bowed. The silence that followed their retreat was heavy, but it wasn't awkward, it was respect. The kind of respect earned not by fear alone, but by the demonstration of unshakable strength. She picked up the chalk again, as though nothing had happened, and turned back to the board. Her hand moved steadily, writing out the next part of the lesson as if tossing two bullies across the classroom had been just another minor interruption. But her words carried more weight now. When she explained a concept, the students listened. When she asked a question, hands shot into the air. Even the ones who usually slouched in their chairs were leaning forward, eager not to miss a single detail. It wasn't just obedience, it was admiration. For the first time, they weren't just seeing a teacher, they were seeing someone formidable, someone who commanded both respect and awe. The energy in the room had transformed completely. Students who had once expected to endure a boring period now felt as though they were in the presence of a legend. Every glance exchanged, every whisper passed from desk to desk carried the same message: she's different. She's not like the others. She's untouchable. By the end of the lesson, even the toughest kids were sitting upright, hanging on her every word. When the bell finally rang, no one rushed out the door as they normally did. Instead, they hesitated, their eyes flicking back to her as if waiting for one final command. She looked at them with calm confidence, a faint smile tugging at the corners of her lips. "Class dismissed," she said simply. The students filed out quietly, their usual rowdiness replaced with murmurs of disbelief and excitement. Some whispered about the throws, others about the look on the bullies' faces, but all agreed on one thing: this new teacher had changed everything. As the last student left, the two bullies lingered near the door, still avoiding her gaze. They muttered something that could have been an apology, barely audible, but sincere in its own awkward way, before slipping out. She didn't respond, didn't need to. The lesson had already been learned. The classroom was empty now, but the silence she left behind carried weight. She had arrived as just another substitute, underestimated and tested. But she had proven herself with a calm ferocity none of them would forget. From that day forward, her reputation would precede her. She wasn't just a teacher. She was someone who could not be broken, someone who demanded respect, and got it.